Welcome to a deep dive exploring the incredible but also incredibly tumultuous early years of independent India.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Imagine a country born, right at midnight, stepping into freedom, but immediately facing this whirlwind of challenges, things that really threatened its very existence from day one.
And our dive today, it focuses on a stack of sources that really let us unpack three massive hurdles this new nation had to overcome basically in its first decade after 1947.
Exactly.
So the mission for this particular deep dive is to really dig into these sources, understand the sheer scale of those challenges we're talking, partition, right? Then integrating the hundreds of princely states, and also that massive task of redrawing the country's internal map.
Mm-hmm. And see how India began to navigate them. Because you're right, those early choices, they really set the stage for, well, everything that followed.
It's like Jawaharlal Nehru said on the eve of independence, a moment of immense hope.
Yeah, he said, India will awake to a life of freedom. We step out from the old to the new. We end today a period of ill fortune, and India discovers herself again. The achievement we celebrate today is but a step, an opening of opportunity. Beautiful words.
But there was also this profound sense of the difficulty ahead. Mahatma Gandhi offered a really stark warning.
He did. He said, today you have worn on your heads a crown of thorns. The seat of power is a nasty thing. You have to remain ever wakeful. Now there will be no end to your being tested.
Wow, a crown of thorns. And those tests, well, they began immediately. Oh. No waiting around.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Here's where it gets really interesting. That freedom, August 14th, 15th, 1947, it didn't just arrive on its own.
No, absolutely not. It arrived hand in hand with partition.
Right.
So you get not one, but two nation states, India and Pakistan. And look, this wasn't some sudden decision. It was really the culmination of complex political developments, rooted particularly in the two-nation theory pushed by the Muslim League.
Which the Congress Party fundamentally opposed. Fundamentally opposed, yes.
Okay. And the process of actually dividing the country, based on religious majorities, yes. But the sources make it clear it was incredibly painful and difficult to implement on the ground. It wasn't neat at all.
Oh, far from it. Take problem one. There wasn't one single big contiguous Muslim majority area. So Pakistan ended up being created in two parts. West Pakistan and East Pakistan, separated by over 1,000 miles of Indian territory. Just think about that logistically.
A nightmare. And problem two, something I think gets overlooked sometimes, not all the Muslim majority areas actually wanted to join Pakistan.
Exactly. Think of Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan in the Northwest Frontier Province. People called him the Frontier Gandhi.
Right.
A staunch follower of nonviolence, totally opposed to the two-nation theory. But despite the wishes of many people there, his voice, well, it was essentially ignored, and the NWFP was merged into Pakistan.
Then you had these major provinces like Punjab and Bengal. They had huge non-Muslim populations mixed in, significant numbers.
Absolutely. So they couldn't just divide the province. They had to divide them down to the district level, or sometimes even lower, like the Tehsil or Thana.
So you could literally wake up on Independence Day and genuinely not know which country your village or even your house was suddenly in.
That's exactly what the sources describe. They call it the deepest trauma, that uncertainty.
That alone is just staggering. And maybe the hardest part, the most intractable problem, was the minorities left on both sides.
Yes. You had millions, literally lakhs of Hindus and Sikhs in the areas that became Pakistan, and an equally large number of Muslims on the Indian side, especially places like Punjab, Bengal, and around Delhi.
And overnight, they found themselves labeled as, undesirable aliens.
Undesirable aliens, yeah. In the only homes they'd ever known, places their families might have lived for centuries.
And this wasn't just like a theoretical problem. What actually followed was, the sources say one of the largest, most abrupt, unplanned, and just tragic transfers of population in human history.
The scale of violence was just horrific. Widespread killings, atrocities committed by people on both sides. Cities like Lahore, Amritsar, Kolkata, they fractured, became these brutal communal zones.
People forced to flee with sometimes just hours' notice.
Sometimes just hours. Many ended up in these makeshift refugee camps for months, sometimes even years. And the journeys themselves, whether on foot or crammed onto trains, were incredibly dangerous.
Constant threat of attack, killings, and widespread sexual violence against women.
Yes, the sources are very clear about that. Thousands of women abducted on both sides. Forced conversions, forced marriages. And in this horrifying twist, reflecting the intense communal pressure, some women were tragically killed by their own family members to protect family honor.
God, that's awful.
Children separated from their parents in the chaos. I mean, the sources mention writers like Sadat Hassan Manto. His stories capture the stark reality. There's one where rioters stop a train, commit just unspeakable violence against people from one community, and then offer the remaining passengers food, apologizing for the delay. It's a small detail, but it just punches you in the gut, shows the completely twisted reality of the time.
Wow.
Survivors and artists, poets like Faiz Ahmed Faiz and Amrita Pritam, they talk about this era not just as a division of land, but a division of hearts.
And the division, it was total, wasn't it? Not just boundaries.
Absolutely total. Properties, liabilities, financial assets, even the entire administrative machinery had to be split. It gets down to almost absurd levels of detail, dividing office furniture, paper clips, library books.
Even the musical instruments of the police band.
Even those. Government employees, railway staff, everyone suddenly had to choose which nation they belonged to.
Their sheer numbers are just mind-boggling. Estimated 8 million people. It's 80 lakh migrating across the new border.
And the human cost.
Yeah.
Devastating. Estimates range from 500,000 up to possibly 1 million people killed in the violence.
So, given that partition happened largely along religious lines, it really raised this fundamental question for India, didn't it? Did this automatically mean India became a Hindu nation?
That's a really critical point, because even after that massive traumatic migration, India still had a very significant Muslim population, around 12% back in 1951.
And there were definitely competing visions out there. You had the Muslim League, which had obviously pushed for a separate state for Muslims. And within India, you had various Hindu organizations arguing that India should be defined primarily as a Hindu nation.
But, and this is a key takeaway from the sources, most of the leaders of the national movement, the ones who are now in charge, held a very different, very powerful belief.
Which was?
They insisted that India must treat people of all religions equally. The idea of giving superior status to one faith over others was something they fundamentally rejected.
And that ideal, the ideal of a secular nation where your citizenship didn't depend on your religion, that's what they worked to embed in the Indian Constitution.
Exactly. And Mahatma Gandhi's actions during this period are incredibly telling, I think.
He didn't join the Independence Day celebrations in Delhi, did he?
No, he was in Kolkata, trying to stop the horrific riots that were tearing the city apart. He was deeply saddened, apparently feeling that his life's work on nonviolence, on Satyagraha, had somehow failed at this crucial moment.
And he used fasting as a tool, right?
Yes. First in Kolkata, which did help bring a temporary calm, actually allowed some joint Hindu-Muslim celebrations of independence there for a brief period. But then riots flared up again and later exploded in Delhi. He felt he had to act again.
What was driving him then?
Well, the sources suggest two main things. He was profoundly concerned that Muslims should be able to live safely in India with dignity as equal citizens. And he was also really troubled by the deteriorating relationship with Pakistan and felt India should honor its financial commitments to the new state, even amidst all the tension.
So it was with those concerns that he undertook his last fast in January 1948.
Yes. And much like in Kolkata, it had this dramatic calming effect in Delhi. The sources say tensions and violence noticeably eased. Many Muslims who had fled the city felt safe enough to return to their homes. And significantly, the government reversed its earlier decision and agreed to pay Pakistan its financial dues.
But his efforts weren't universally liked.
Tragically, no. Extremists on both sides resented his stance, his calls for peace and equality. And just days after ending his fast, on January 30th, 1948, during an evening prayer meeting in Delhi, he was assassinated by Nathuram Vinayak Godse.
A devastating end. So while partition was this wrenching tearing apart of the country, there was this other enormous challenge happening at the same time, which was about putting it together, specifically integrating the princely states.
Right, because British India wasn't just the provinces directly under British rule. It also included these 565, give or take, large and small states. They covered about a third of the land area and maybe a quarter of the population.
And they were ruled by princes who had accepted British authority, this concept of paramountcy.
Exactly. But the problem was, the British simply announced that paramountcy would lapse when they left. Poof. Gone.
Which meant
all 565 of these states would technically become legally independent entities on August 15th, 1947.
Wow. And the rulers were given the choice Join India, join Pakistan, or just stay independent.
And crucially, this decision rested solely with the ruler, not with the millions of people living in their state.
That's a huge threat, isn't it? India could have just fragmented into hundreds of little independent countries.
A massive threat. And it was also this fundamental contradiction for a newly democratic India, because most of these states were run, well, non-democratically. The rulers often had no intention of giving their people democratic rights.
And you saw trouble brewing straight away.
Oh, yeah. Early signs. The rulers of Travancore down south and Hyderabad right in the middle, they announced they planned to be independent. The Nawab of Bhopal was openly campaigning against joining India's Constituent Assembly.
So the interim government, the one leading India to independence, had to take a very firm stance against this potential fragmentation.
Absolutely. They couldn't let the country break apart further.
And this is where Sardar Patel comes in. As Deputy Prime Minister and Home Minister, the sources consistently describe his role as historic. He was the main person tasked with negotiating with all these rulers.
And his approach, it seems, was this blend of firmness but also diplomacy. He managed, through painstaking negotiation, to bring most of the states into the Indian Union.
It wasn't just about, waving a big stick. It required incredibly skillful persuasion, as the sources put it.
Definitely. I mean, think about the sheer complexity. In areas like modern-day Orissa, there were 26 small states they had to deal with. In the Saurashtra region of Gujarat, there were literally hundreds of different administrative units, big states, tiny estates, chiefships. Negotiating with every single one required immense skill and patience.
So what guided the government's approach? The sources mentioned 3 key ideas.
Yeah, first, and maybe most importantly, was the recognition that the overwhelming majority of the people living in most of these states clearly wanted to join India. Their will was evident.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
Second, the government showed itself willing to be flexible. They offered some degree of autonomy to different regions, recognizing that India was inherently diverse, plural. It wasn't about imposing uniformity everywhere.
Right, accommodation.
And third, and this was absolutely crucial, especially with partition fresh in everyone's minds, the territorial integration and consolidation of the nation was seen as supremely important. You just couldn't risk having these independent, potentially hostile islands scattered within India's borders.
And it worked, for the most part, relatively quickly.
For most, yes. Before August 15th, 1947, the majority of states whose territory was contiguous with India had signed this document called the Instrument of Accession.
And that basically meant they agreed to let the Indian government handle things like defense, external affairs, and communications, right? While retaining some internal control initially.
Exactly. But a few states proved particularly difficult. Junagadh, which had a Muslim ruler but a largely Hindu population, that was resolved by a plebiscite, a direct vote by the people who overwhelmingly chose India.
Okay.
Then Kashmir, which the sources note has a much longer, complex history that we're not diving into today. And then Hyderabad and Manipur.
Right. Let's focus on Hyderabad and Manipur because the sources give some detail there. Hyderabad.
Hyderabad was the largest of the princely states. Smack bang in the middle of India, entirely surrounded by Indian territory. Its ruler, the Nizam, was fabulously wealthy, one of the richest men in the world at the time.
And he wanted independence.
He did. He signed a temporary standstill agreement with India, basically buying a year to figure things out while negotiations continued.
But things didn't stay still within Hyderabad, did they?
Not at all. While the Nizam was negotiating, a huge popular movement erupted inside the state against his oppressive rule. You had peasants in the Telangana region, women who had suffered terribly under the feudal system, communists, the local Hyderabad Congress Party members. They were all rising up, demanding change and democratic rights.
And how did the Nizam respond?
Brutally. He unleashed this private paramilitary force called the Razakars. They became notorious for their atrocities and communal violence, murder, rape, looting, specifically targeting the non-Muslim population. The situation got completely out of hand.
So the central government felt it had to intervene.
Yes. In September 1948, the Indian Army was sent in. It's sometimes called police action. After just a few days of fighting, the Nizam's forces were overwhelmed, he surrendered, and Hyderabad formally acceded to India.
Okay, quite decisive there. What about Manipur? That sounds like a different story.
A bit different, yes. Just before independence, the Maharaja Bodhchandra Singh signed the Instrument of Accession, but he got assurances that Manipur would keep its internal autonomy.
And he actually held elections.
He did. Facing pressure from the public, he held elections in June 1948, and Manipur became a constitutional monarchy. This is a really significant detail. The sources point out it was the first part of India to hold an election based on universal adult franchise, every adult getting a vote.
Wow. Okay, so democracy was taking root there, but then...
But then the elected Legislative Assembly in Manipur, the body representing the people, was actually split on the question of merging fully with India. There wasn't consensus.
Despite that lack of consensus.
Despite that, the government of India, according to the sources, succeeded in pressurizing the Maharaja.
Pressurizing him how?
The details aren't fully laid out, but the outcome was that they got him to sign a merger agreement in September 1949. And here's the really crucial point. They did this without consulting the popularly elected Legislative Assembly.
Whoa.
Yeah, and the sources are quite clear. This caused a lot of anger and resentment in Manipur, resentment about the way the merger happened, the lack of consultation, and they note that the repercussions of that are still being felt today.
So it really highlights that even within this generally successful integration process, there were moments where, perhaps under the pressure to consolidate the nation quickly, democratic principles might have been, let's say, sidelined.
That seems to be the implication, yes. A complex picture.
Okay, so the nation was formed, the external boundaries consolidated, more or less, by integrating the states. But the massive task of building the nation wasn't finished. The third major challenge the sources highlight was drawing the internal boundaries, the state lines within India.
Exactly. And this wasn't just about drawing lines on a map for administrative convenience. The goal, or at least the hope, was to create state boundaries that could somehow reflect India's immense linguistic and cultural diversity.
But crucially, without fracturing national unity. That was the balancing act.
That was the tightrope, yeah.
Wow.
Because this was a huge departure from the past. The colonial boundaries under the British, they were completely artificial.
Right, just based on administrative convenience or which bits of territory they happened to conquer or annex at different times, or where the princely states were.
Precisely. Whereas the national movement, interestingly, had actually promised linguistic states during the freedom struggle. They'd even organized their own internal Congress party structure along linguistic zones way back in the 1920s.
So people expected it.
People absolutely expected it. But then, after independence, and especially after the absolute trauma and violence of partition, the national leadership got cold feet.
Wow.
They started worrying. They feared that reorganizing states based on language right then might unleash more disruption, more division, maybe even lead to disintegration. They felt it would distract from other really urgent challenges like social reform and economic development. So the initial decision was, let's postpone this. Let's put it on the back burner.
And how did that go down?
Predictably, not well. That postponement was immediately challenged. You had intense popular pressure building up from people and local leaders across the country who felt their linguistic identity wasn't being recognized.
And was there one movement that really pushed things forward?
Yes, the movement that really acted as the catalyst began in the Telugu-speaking areas of the old, sprawling Madras province, which at the time covered parts of what are now Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Kerala, and Karnataka.
Okay.
There was a strong movement there called the Vishalandra movement, demanding a separate Andhra province specifically for Telugu speakers.
And this movement gained momentum because the central government was dragging its feet.
Exactly. The government seemed hesitant, unsure. Then came this tragic turning point. Padishramulu. He was a respected Congress leader, a veteran Gandhian, deeply committed to the cause. He went on an indefinite fast, specifically demanding the formation of Andhra State.
An indefinite fast.
Yes. And he died after 56 days in December 1952.
Wow. What happened then?
His death just sparked absolute chaos, widespread unrest, violent protests erupted across the Telugu-speaking regions. There was police firing, injuries, sadly some deaths. State legislators resigned in protest. The pressure became immense, undeniable.
So it forced the government's hand.
Completely. Within days of Siramalu's death, Prime Minister Nehru announced the formation of a separate Andhra state.
And this is where, as the sources kind of suggest, the dam broke.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. Andhra's creation proved that popular pressure, even involving tragedy, could work. And it immediately spurred similar demands and movements for linguistic states in other parts of India, people demanding states for Marathi speakers, Gujarati speakers, Kannada speakers, and so on.
So this overwhelming pressure essentially forced the central government to act more broadly.
Yes. They appointed the States Reorganization Commission, the SRC, in 1953 to look into the whole issue nationwide.
And what did the commission conclude?
It undertook a massive exercise, looked at all the claims, and in its report, it accepted the core principle that state boundaries should, as far as possible, reflect the boundaries of different languages.
And that led to legislation.
Yes, based largely on that report, the States Reorganization Act was passed in 1956. This act led to the creation of 14 states and 6 union territories, fundamentally redrawing India's internal map along linguistic lines.
Now, here's something really fascinating that the sources point out. Many people at the time, including some leaders initially, had feared that creating states based on language would actually endanger India's unity, that it would foster separatism.
That was the big fear, absolutely.
But the sources argue, interestingly, that the opposite happened.
Yes, that's the argument presented, that by accepting these regional and linguistic claims, even though it was under intense popular pressure, the Indian state actually reduced the threat of division and, in the long run, strengthened national unity.
How so? Why would that be the case?
Well, the thinking is, it was seen as a more democratic approach. It was an accommodation of the country's incredible diversity, rather than an attempt to suppress it or impose uniformity from the top down.
Okay, that makes sense. People felt their identity was recognized.
Exactly. It also, importantly, helped to open up politics and power beyond just the small, English-speaking elite who had been concentrated in the old colonial provincial capitals. It gave a more uniform, understandable basis language for state boundaries, unlike the arbitrary lines drawn by the British.
And it's worth remembering this wasn't just a one-time thing in 1956, was it? The reorganization continued.
Oh, absolutely. The process didn't stop there. The bilingual Bombay state, for instance, was split into Maharashtra and Gujarat in 1960 after more agitation, the Mahagujarat movement. Punjab was reorganized later in 1966, leading to the creation of Haryana and Himachal Pradesh.
And new states in the Northeast?
Yes, Nagaland in 1963, then Meghalaya, Manipur, Tripura in 1972, Arunachal Pradesh and Mizoram in 1987. And even later, you had states created based on arguments about distinct cultural identity or regional development imbalances, like Chhattisgarh, Uttarakhand, and Jharkhand in the year 2000.
And Telangana, more recently in 2014, splitting from Andhra Pradesh.
Exactly. And even today, you still hear movements advocating for the creation of smaller states in different parts of the country. So it's an ongoing process, in a way.
So, okay, let's try and pull this together. What does this all mean? Looking back at these 3 huge foundational challenges, the sheer trauma of partition and its aftermath, the incredibly complex and delicate integration of over 500 princely states, and then this massive undertaking of redrawing the entire country's internal map based on language and identity.
Yeah, when you look at it like that, laid out from these sources, it becomes incredibly clear that independent India faced an almost unimaginable task right from day one. They were simultaneously trying to build a nation, establish a working democracy, consolidate a unified state structure, all under conditions of immense pressure and immediate crisis.
And the choices they made, I mean, that fundamental decision to pursue a secular state, despite the religiously charged context of partition, using that mix of firmness, diplomacy, flexibility, and sometimes even pressure, as we saw, to integrate the states. And then ultimately embracing linguistic reorganization, largely because of popular demand. These clearly weren't easy decisions. And as that Manipur example showed, they certainly weren't always smooth or, perfectly democratic in their execution or universally accepted at the time. No, definitely not always smooth.
Yep.
But navigating these early challenges, as this material really highlights, it fundamentally shaped the very nature of Indian democracy, didn't it? It established this crucial, maybe defining idea for India, achieving unity through the accommodation and acceptance of diversity and plurality, rather than trying to suppress those powerful regional and linguistic identities. So this deep dive into the sources about India's very first steps, it really reveals a nation being forged in crisis, making these incredibly high-stakes decisions about its identity, its structure, right from the moment of its birth.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? The sources just briefly touch on this, sort of comparing India's nation-building process to the Soviet experiment. Both were these huge, incredibly diverse political entities facing immense challenges of consolidation and managing identity in the mid-20th century.
Right. While the sources don't really go into depth on that comparison, just considering how vastly different the eventual outcomes were for India, which remains a diverse democracy, and the Soviet Union, which ultimately collapsed, it does raise a really provocative question for you, the listener, to ponder.
What fundamental differences were there in their approaches to nation building, particularly maybe regarding democracy and the acceptance or suppression of internal diversity? Could those differences help explain those very divergent historical paths?
Yeah, definitely something to think about.